Dear students, welcome to the second video, which is the equivalent to JavaScript in 2020. It's CSS in 2020. This is also more of a linked list, and I will give you a quick overview, and I would ask you to read those blog articles and get yourself used to using these new CSS features. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how to structure your JavaScript. There are a lot of ways to go about your CSS architecture, because as you know, all CSS on a page is global, which is why there are multiple guidelines, best practices, or naming conventions on how to organize your JavaScript. Of course, in SPAs, like when using React or Vue.js, it's very easy to structure your JavaScript because you can work component-based. And in all of the modern frameworks, your CSS is component scoped, so you don't have this problem of a global namespace. But I quickly want to give you an overview. So one of the oldest ways, object-oriented CSS. Then there was, I don't even know what SMAC stands for anymore. I think it was scalable and modular CSS. BEM is block element modifier, and IT CSS is inverse triangle CSS. The most popular right now is BEM, which is what you might encounter. And there's a good introduction article to BEM, which is block element modifier. And the basic concept is just that you write your classes or your HTML classes in a component-based way. So you always have a component or a block, and elements of that block are denoted with the double underscore, but this is just a suggestion. Of course, you can write your own style or your own BEM way, but this is the most popular one. And each block and each element has a base style, and usually you have variations on the base style, which is in BEM called modifier. So when you have a button is a few child elements, and a button could be orange and big. And this is how you structure your CSS. So just read up on that. It's a very easy way to structure your CSS. So the next thing, layout in 2020. There are two ways. Of course, there's the old way with lots of floats and tables even, but now all layout usually is done with Flexbox and Grid. So I think you do have some experience with Flexbox. If not, there's this awesome guide on CSS tricks. This is not just for learning, but also when you forgot how something works or just want to quickly look something up. Use this guide because it has very nice diagrams, all of those images that explain really well how all of the properties work. And if you want a more hands-on approach, you can also use the Solved by Flexbox page, which has examples for layouts that you need very often. For example, the media object, which is something that you will eventually use in your project. A media object, if you don't know, here there's also a hint that it originated in the object-oriented CSS, and it's just text besides an image, which was difficult to do in the early days. But with Flexbox, it's actually pretty easy. Yeah, so have a look at that. Now, the other thing is CSS Grid. So Flexbox is not meant for more complex layouts. This is where Grid comes in, because Grid is even more powerful than Flexbox. There's also a guide on CSS tricks regarding Grid. So it looks similar. It also has these large graphics that help you understand what's happening. So Grid is basically subdividing your page into rows and columns and telling the browser what to render in what row and what column. And this can be a bit overwhelming. This is also more of a guide and a quick reference. If you want to learn how the Grid works, you should head over to Grid by Example. I can recommend Grid by Example. And yeah, there's a start here, but actually you should start with the examples and just go through the examples and play with them. There are, I think, 30 examples, and each one builds on the other one. So you can just start with the first example, defining a grid. All of them have a CodePen editor where you can see how the grid works. So in this first example, we define a grid. The grid has 3 columns that are each 100 pixels wide. There are gaps between the grid elements, and yeah, you can see that all of the elements are then automatically placed inside the grid. You can edit this on CodePen to play around with it, and yeah, if you understand it, you can move on to the next example. Of course, you can use the overview page, but you can also just rewrite the URL and you're in the second example. This is more complex because in this example, the children are explicitly placed on the grid. In a very verbose way, there is a shorter way which you will learn in the next example. And this is how this builds on each example, and the last examples are actually pretty complex, where you have a grid where children span multiple rows and multiple columns and stuff like that. So yeah, if you want to do your big page layout, please use a grid. If you want to do layout for smaller elements, please opt for Flexbox, and also think about what would be a better idea. So now, another thing that has been added to CSS is custom properties. It's called custom properties, but most people call them CSS variables. There's a great blog article with examples on where you would use CSS variables. If you've never seen them, they look like this. So in any selector or in any CSS block, you write dash dash and then your variable name, and you can reuse the value of this variable with var in any other or in any other child element. If you use it on the root, you can of course use the variable in all of your selectors, in all of your declarations. Yeah, so it's variables. They are very helpful. To not rewrite stuff. You wouldn't even need a CSS preprocessor for most of the things nowadays. And yeah, there is also a pattern where you can use them for default values. They are also very easily to change via JavaScript, so you can just change a variable in JavaScript and all of the CSS will update. Or you could even, there should also be an example for this, you could even read a data property, or you could use an inline style to change a default setting. Inline properties, yeah, like here. So you could write something like this. Your styles have a variable with a default setting, and when you overwrite the variable with an inline style, you can change your CSS, which is a cool example. Have a look at it. And yeah, another thing that's new is the add supports flag. The add supports, or not flag, the add supports query helps us to test for CSS features. Of course, it's not supported in every browser, but as soon as it is, you can better handle whether your browser supports something or not. And if it supports it, you can do CSS A, and if it's not supporting that feature, you can do CSS B. How this works can also be found on CSS Tricks. Of course, there's official documentation and documentation on MDN, but CSS Tricks here has really the best articles. So the supports query is just add supports, and then you write a CSS property. And if the browser supports this feature and understands this property, you can do some styling. So yeah, classic use case would be to write the layout and write the layout that works in all the browsers. And if the browser supports grid, you can do a grid layout, which is done here. So here you have a layout with a flexbox, and if the browser supports grid, it's replaced with a layout with grid. This is cool. And the last thing that I want to show you is an example where custom properties and add supports have been used, which is a very clever example on how to build responsive iframes. The example looks like this. It uses a lot of cool CSS features. So in the end, you have a responsive iframe that always keeps its aspect ratio, which you can use for video embeds and stuff like this. And the way it works is you just have your style, and in the style you can set the aspect ratio of the embedded content. And in the div, of course, there is the iframe or whatever. Now, how this works is there are a few settings that are independent of the aspect ratio. Of course, you could also use a class here instead of looking for the variable aspect ratio, so that your wrapper always has width of 100% and height of auto. You can also do this with classes, but with the attribute selector, you only need to look for an inline style where the aspect ratio is changed. Now, this add supports query tests for custom properties. You could also do it like this, or just give the browser something that it can execute. Now, when the browser supports the custom property, of course, the inline style always works. So the selectors work even if the browser doesn't support the custom properties, but yeah, in this case there's this special check. So if the browser doesn't support custom properties, in this case the iframe will not be scaled, but still be accessible. Now, and as soon as the browser supports the custom property, the old padding trick is used to create a block that has a certain aspect ratio. The way this works is you give your iframe, which in this case is the first child, but it could also be an iframe. If you want other embedded content, of course you have to make this selector more general, which has been done here with the first child. You create a div that has the exact aspect ratio, and in this div you will blow up your iframe, which is happening here with the position absolute, top left, and the height of 100%. So it fills the div. And the div itself gets its size from this pseudo element, which is of course also 100 width wide, but it has no height. And the height is given via the padding. Now, a thing that you should know is that if you use a percentage value on a padding, the percentage value is relative to the width of an element, which is why this works. Yeah, so have a look at this, try to understand it. It's a really cool example of using custom properties. And yeah, if you do styling for your projects, please use these new features and hit me up if you have any questions. That's all for now for CSS in 2020.